A racist officer thought he pulled over just another black man. But moments later, he realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his career, and the entire city would soon know why. The afternoon sun hung low over the small suburban town of Ridgewood, a place that liked to pretend it had no problems. The kind of town where people said things like everyone gets along here, even though they knew it wasn't true. Beneath the surface of the manicured lawns and friendly waves lived an undercurrent everyone felt but no one talked about, especially inside the police department. Officer Rick Halden cruised down Maple Avenue, tapping the steering wheel with impatient fingers. He wasn't having a good day. In fact, Rick never seemed to have a good day. He always appeared irritated at the world, at the people in it, and especially at the people who didn't look like him. Rick believed he could spot trouble from a mile away, not because of experience, not because of training, but because of assumptions he'd carved deep into his mind over years of bad influences and unchecked biases. And today, as he saw a shiny black SUV roll past him, he felt that familiar spark of irritation. Out-of-state plates? He muttered. Big car, tinted windows. Yeah, let's see what this is about. He hit his lights without hesitation. Inside the SUV, the driver, a tall, clean-cut black man in his late 40s, glanced into his mirror. No panic, no fumbling, no sudden movements, just a calm expression, followed by a slow, controlled pull to the side of the road. He had expected this. He had expected this because stories like his weren't stories, they were cycles. Officer Rick swaggered up to the driver's window. He didn't say hello. He didn't say his name. He didn't say why he stopped him. License, registration. Now the driver looked up gently, offering a polite nod. Of course, officer, may I ask why I was stopped? Rick scoffed. You asking me questions already. I'll tell you why when I feel like it. License and registration. Last chance. The man kept his composure, though anyone could see the disrespect was intentional, sharp, and meant to provoke. He handed over the documents calmly. Rick snatched them and looked them over. The name read, David Warren, H.M. Rick muttered. Car like this. Job like yours. Mind telling me how you afford it? The driver gave a small, weary smile. Same way anyone else does. Officer, hard work. Rick didn't like that answer. He didn't like anything about this man, his calmness, his politeness, his confidence. In Rick's world, those traits didn't belong to someone who looked like the man sitting in front of him. Step out of the car. Rick said. The man blinked. Is there a reason? I said, step out. There were people watching now. Drivers slowing down. A woman walking her dog, pausing to see what was happening. In a town like Ridgewood, these moments spread fast. But the driver did as asked. Slowly, respectfully, hands visible at all times. Turn around. Rick barked. Hands on the car. The man complied again. Even as humiliation settled in, Rick ran his hands along the man's sides, doing a sloppy, aggressive pat down that had no real purpose except to assert power. You visiting someone? Rick asked. You don't look like you belong around here. The words hung heavy in the air. Even the dog-walking woman flinched. The driver took a controlled breath. Officer, I assure you I belong exactly where I need to be. Rick rolled his eyes and walked back to his patrol car to run the man's license. He typed the name with the energy of someone eager to prove a point. Then suddenly, the system flashed something unexpected. A note, a highlighted one. Incoming Police Chief David Warren. Rick froze. What? He typed the name again. Same result. Same alert. Same punch of reality to his chest. Incoming. Police Chief Rick began to sweat. His heart thudded. His face drained of color. He looked up slowly, staring at the man standing beside the SUV, dignified, patient, and painfully aware of what had just happened. Rick swallowed hard. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This wasn't just another day. This was his future boss. The man he had just profiled, embarrassed, disrespected, and manhandled, was the new leader of their entire department, and he had no idea what the man had already seen, or what he was thinking, or what he would say next. Rick stepped out of his patrol car, suddenly walking like someone learning to use legs for the first time. Sir, Mr. Warren, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The man slowly turned around. No, he said softly, I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional, but it was disappointed, and somehow, that hurt Rick more than yelling ever could have. Sir, please, if we could just talk about this, we will. David replied, at the station. After I finished the business, I came here for. Rick's breathing quickened. David reached for his documents. Am I free to go? He asked. Rick nodded quickly. Yes, absolutely. I mean yes, sir. Chief. David stepped into his SUV, closed the door, and drove away, leaving Rick standing in the middle of the road feeling like the world had just collapsed on top of him because it had, and the day wasn't even close to being over. The sun dipped behind the buildings as David Warren drove toward the Ridgewood Police Department. His hands sat steady on the steering wheel, but inside, he felt that familiar cocktail of frustration and resolve. This wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, and he knew it wouldn't magically be the last, not even for a man who had spent decades serving communities, saving lives, and breaking through ceilings designed to keep men like him out. He had joined law enforcement not because he wanted power, but because he wanted change. And days like this, painful as they were, only strengthened his mission. As he approached the station, David couldn't help but notice the building's outdated signage, the fading letters, and the worn brick exterior. Ridgewood was smaller than the cities he'd worked in before, but the problems here were just as real, just as deep. Sometimes, they were even more hidden. He parked his SUV in the designated chief of police spot. The title still felt surreal, not because he wasn't qualified, but because of what it symbolized: a chance to lead, to reform, and to rebuild trust. But before he could take that first step inside, he paused. He replayed the encounter with Officer Rick. The tone, disrespect, the casual assumption of guilt, the words "you don't look like you belong around here." He exhaled sharply. "All right," he whispered to himself, "time to work." Inside the station, officers moved about with the usual rhythm of shifting papers, answering phones, and chatting in small clusters. When David stepped through the doors, heads turned, some with curiosity, others with confusion, and a few with thinly veiled skepticism. Standing near the reception desk was Captain Harris, a graying man with a stiff posture and a permanent frown carved into his features. He straightened when he saw David. "Chief Warren?" the captain asked. "That would be me," David replied with a polite smile. "Welcome," Harris said, though his tone lacked warmth. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "I wanted to get a head start," David said. "Thought I'd drop by early." Harris nodded, though he looked uneasy. "Of course. Well, we're glad to have you." He said the words as if repeating a line from a script he didn't believe in. As they walked deeper into the building, David took in everything: the glass-encased awards, the bulletin boards, the small details that revealed how the department operated. He saw a few officers whispering. He saw others stiffen with surprise or awkwardness. But he remained calm. He had faced worse than whispers. Harris led him into the conference room. The long table was cluttered with files and paperwork. A pot of coffee brewed in the corner. "We'll have the full staff meeting tomorrow morning," Harris explained, "but I can at least show you your office." Before they could continue, the door creaked open. And in walked Officer Rick Halden. His eyes locked onto David's. His face went pale. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. David maintained a neutral expression. "Rick," Captain Harris said, unaware of the tension, "this is Chief Warren." Rick swallowed hard. "Why? We've met." David raised an eyebrow. Briefly, Harris smiled weakly. "Good, good. Then introductions are handled." He turned to David. "Shall we?" David walked toward his new office as Rick stood frozen, shame and panic battling inside him. When David and Harris disappeared from view, Rick collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What have I done?" David's new office was modest: a wooden desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a window overlooking the parking lot. But it wasn't the room that mattered. It was what he intended to do in it. "This is all yours," Harris said. "If you need anything, forms, access codes, welcoming materials, just let me know." "Thank you," David replied. "I'll settle in." Harris nodded and left, closing the door behind him. For a moment, the room was quiet. David placed his hands on the desk and exhaled. This job was going to be harder than he expected, not because of the workload, but because of the culture. A culture already showing itself on day one. He sat down and began going through paperwork, onboarding documents, department policies, performance reports. Everything he read painted a picture of a department with rigid habits and too little accountability. There were reports of complaints brushed aside, training records that hadn't been updated in years, a few internal affairs files that had mysteriously disappeared between administrations. "Interesting," David murmured, but his review was interrupted by a soft knock on the door.